Good morning and welcome to the Veterans Forum. This is another program wherein we've had some of the guys who served in any of the branches tell their story, share their experiences with us in a recorded interview. It's part of the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project that began back in the year 2000. The objective, quite simply, is this. Each guy and gal had a job to do, and they did it. Imagine, if you will, this is a great big puzzle, our history of wars, if you will. And each one of us is a piece in that puzzle. What we're trying to do, and it's a very time-consuming project, and it's amazing how difficult some of it can be, is to have every guy and gal who was that piece fit their piece in that puzzle so that the picture is expanded and we can get a clear picture for the guys and gals, our grandkids coming after us. What did you do in the war, Grandpa? Some of us have some gory stories, some funny things. But the bottom line is, if you don't tell your story, nobody else will. And today we're going to have another one just like that. I'll ask Frank to introduce himself, and we'll get the show on the road. Okay? Doctor, you're on. If you would, please tell us your name, spell your last name, and where you now live.
Frank A. Muset, M-U-S-E-T. I'm 93 years old. I live in an old age home in Manchester, Alliance Way. I'm retired for about 70 years. I happen to be an MD, a medical doctor. I did some time in service from 1940 to 1946, and I'm here to tell whatever questions I may be happy to answer.
Okay, that's fair enough. I'll start right off this. What was your rank at time of discharge?
Captain.
Captain of the U.S. Army Medical Corps. But you had a little preface before that. What was the prelude?
Well, as a medical student, we were advised that we would be drafted unless we volunteered to become Medical Administrative Corps as medical students.
This is when?
1940.
Thank you.
As the war was approaching, we were asked to volunteer, otherwise we'd be open for drafting. And they guaranteed that they will allow us to finish medical school. So we did volunteer as Medical Administrative Corps. They gave us commissions as second lieutenants in the Medical Administrative Corps, MAC. And they would allow us to finish medical schools and 9 months of internship. In my particular year, my graduation, which ordinarily would have been in June, finished in March, because we are the first to be taken into service without summer vacation of 1942.
Okay, I'm going to hold you right here just for a minute. That establishes how you are now, what your present situation is. But I'd like to build some history. For example, go back, 93 years? Where were you born, when, and where did you live? And how was your family life growing up through the Depression that we went through? You know, the old-fashioned time.
I was born 1920, 31 St. Mark's Place, East Greenwich Village in Manhattan. I was the youngest of three siblings, two older daughters, and I was the only son, the youngest of the three. When the financial situation of the family improved, we moved first to the Bronx, near the old Montefiore Hospital. And then we moved from the Bronx, when the financial situation further improved, to Brooklyn. But unfortunately, when the Depression of 1929 set in, my father lost his job in a luxury business of perfumery, the old Ed Pinaud Perfumery Company, which was a French perfumery company, and perfumes being one of the first casualties, luxuries of human beings. He lost his war, and he began to sell newspapers as his mode of living.
You mean on the corner, delivery boy, or what?
He sold newspapers at the subway stop.
Oh.
The Sea Beach subway ran from Manhattan to Coney Island. So he managed to get a spot on the Avenue U subway station in Brooklyn, which was 3 stops short before it hit Coney Island. So he had a newsstand at that subway station.
Did he build it, or was it something he just moved into?
He started it and moved into as he got permission.
Oh,
He
okay.
sold newspapers, magazines, cigars, cigarettes, candy.
So he had protective property then?
He had a lease.
Oh, okay.
He had a lease to occupy. He just couldn't move in without getting permission from somebody.
No.
So he got a permission from the BMT. I don't know how much money it cost him, that I don't know. But he did have his newsstand at the Avenue T entrance of the Avenue U subway line, which was 3 stops short of Coney Island.
Uh-huh.
The Sea Beach, like all the other BMT lines, Brooklyn Manhattan Transit, ended up in Coney Island. The West End subway ended up in Coney Island. The Brighton Beach subway ended up in Coney Island. The Culver line ended up in Coney Island. And ours, mine, which was the Sea Beach line, all converged and ended up in Coney Island.
So if you had to go across town, you had to go into Coney Island and back out?
Into Manhattan, no, the other reverse you could get into, it went as far as Times Square, 42nd Street, the Sea Beach subway. In fact, we lived on the top of the Sea Beach subway for many years.
In a brownstone?
In a
walk
not in a
up?
brownstone, in a brick building, in a 2-story brick building.
How was life back then in the building? How was your living quarters and so forth?
Well, fortunately, my mother as a seamstress worked. She even worked when we were kids, and we were let loose. I remember, if you're interested in how
Absolutely.
it happened. I was an adventurous little kid, and I used to go off on my own. When my mother worked she was a seamstress in the women's dressing factories, and I'd be left alone, to wander. And at one point, she chained me to a post in the basement of the house we lived in. Actually chained me and said, "Frankie, if you don't tell me where you're going to live, I'm going to keep you chained to this post." So I had to swear and promise to tell my mother whenever I would wander. So she allowed me to wander because up to that point, I never got into trouble. I got into trouble later in Brooklyn, and I'll tell you the story if you're interested. Are
It's
you
your
interested?
life, buddy. Yes, sir.
Well, when when my mother improved, she had to help because my father lost his job. He was selling newspapers, and she was a seamstress and could get jobs anywhere. Oh, that's another story, by the way. I got another story about the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. If you're interested, I'll tell you that story.
We got an hour to go.
So when she worked, she would allow us freedom to say, "Don't try to behave yourself."
Any restrictions about how far you could go and when you had to be back home, or you just said,
I had to
okay?
be back home at supper time.
All right.
At supper time. So when I was allowed some freedom, unfortunately, with a couple of this was now in Brooklyn, we began to pilfer stuff off the counters of the open counters of the Woolworth stores.
Oh, a childhood Robin Hood?
Childhood pen knives and pens and pencils were favorites. So we finally were caught, and we were probably 10 years old, maybe
Okay,
12
all right.
years old. The manager took us by the ears, had us bring in our mothers, who after a spanking came to the store, and we had to promise in front of the Woolworth store manager never to pilfer their stores again. So that was a learning experience. So the very few times, since I was the only and favored son, was I whacked. Well, so one of the very few times I was whacked was when I was stealing with a couple of classmates from the open Woolworth counters. At that time, they didn't bother to lock their goodies. They had open Woolworth counters.
No, they worked in this thing called trust.
And it was a trust system, an honor system, which we unfortunately thought we were
Dishonored.
getting away with.
Yeah. Any legal record of that sort of stuff?
No. My mother's quickly promised the people that it would never happen again. And it never did happen again. Never did happen again.
Dire threat if you did.
No, it never happened again. The thing that straightened me out, I think, because we were kids in Brooklyn, unsupervised, parents out working, The thing that straightened me out was when at age 9 I developed an inguinal hernia and it needed a repair. And my mother, whose only son I was, thought the doctors and hospitals in Brooklyn weren't good enough for her only son. So she took me to the postgraduate hospital, which was a branch of the Columbia Presbyterian Medical System in Manhattan. At that time, Brooklyn was second-rate medical care. And I had a hernia operation at age 9. And at that time, they didn't send you home the same day or even the next day. I was kept in, I don't remember, for a couple of days because they had me embroider a tablecloth. And actually had me embroider.
Yeah.
Can you imagine, as a boy?
Oh, must have loved that.
Must have loved it. They had these women come around and give you things to do. And they made me embroider a cloth and say, wouldn't it be nice if your mother could put it on a dresser? So I was inveigled into doing this dresser cloth, which I gave to my mother. It was a good excuse to keep me working. Anyway, I had a hernia operation. And at that time, I was playing the violin. Fritz Kreisler, if you young people don't remember, was a big name in violin back in the 20s. Fritz Kreisler was the big name in violin in the 20s, and I wanted to play the violin. And my mother, I remember, on a windswept December night, we lived in Brooklyn at the time, went out to find me a violin professor. So I played violin for 2 years, could actually play the intermezzo from Cavalleria Rusticana.
Watch your language.
and a couple other pieces. But things changed when I was in the hospital having my hernia operation and seeing that glorious medical work and those doctors and nurses working. This is what I want to be.
It turned you on.
This is what I want to be. I want to be a doctor.
Good.
So after that, all girls, all folderol went by the bedside.
No sports in high school?
I tried sports in high school. I tried for the baseball team. The manager fungoed. At that time, the word fungo is when they hit a ball up in the air and you're supposed to catch it. They used to call, I think it's not a bad word. It's fungo and mean when you hit the bat, and you have someone at the other end of the field ready to catch it. I flunked.
Oh, you didn't catch it or you couldn't see it?
Or whatever it was, I flunked. So that was a baseball game.
Okay.
Then I figured I had to do something else. I tried for the track team. Well, when they put you on the 100-yard dash, I was the last one who finished the 100-yard dash, so I didn't make the track team. The only test I passed finally without drowning was the required swimming pool test. They were anxious to make sure we would not drown easily, so they had required swimming pool tests of, I forget.
At the YMCA or? In
the school. And I actually went, the high school actually had I was now in high school.
Oh, okay.
Now in high school, because the public schools, the elementary schools, did not have swimming pools. This was in high school, the Utrecht High School in Brooklyn, that did have a swimming pool, and they had swimming pool teams. So fortunately, at that time, it was required to pass the swimming pool test. Of course, they didn't want any kids to drown any place without learning how to do some swimming. And I just managed, so that was the only athletic honor you can give me, that I passed the swimming pool test and didn't drown while I was passing that test. But that was the best of the sports background I could have.
1 out of 3, you got it there.
The best of the sports. Anyway, I managed to save 2 years of, at that time in New York, and I think only New York did it, they had what they called the Progressive School Program, the RA program, where you could save a year if you could get these progressive classes for students that they would nominate.
Okay.
The students who sent. So I managed to save a year. At that time, which I understand they don't do anymore, skippers. So
That's
I saved
double promotion, yeah.
I saved, I understand it's not done anymore. If you have a smart kid, you keep him busy, but you don't advance him with his colleagues, with his classmates. So they would advance us if you had individual brains. So I managed with this RA program to save a year.
So you're a smart guy.
Well, a student, put it that way. I was a good student.
Okay.
This became my life. Study became my life. I had to give up the violin, and study became, I wanted to be a doctor. That was it.
Okay. So,
I
but you're
wanted to be
lucky you had a chance. You had a goal.
Absolutely.
A lot
Thank
is
God I had
wanted.
the goal, because I see so many young kids. And now I'm worried even about one of my grandsons not having a direction. Whatever direction it is, that avoids a lot of trouble on the side. So after that hernia operation at the New York Postgraduate Hospital, I wanted to be a doctor. Now, I didn't know anything about specialties. I didn't know anything about courses, but I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to be like the doctors in the hospital. I wanted to be like them. They became my role models. So I graduated high school at at about 90 degrees, which had allowed me to go to City College, CCNY. At that time, a phenomenon, a tuition-free college.
Yep.
Can you imagine? Tuition now is up 25,000 and higher. A tuition-free college? All it cost me was 20 cents subway fare. There were two systems, the BNT system and the IRT system. Each was a nickel. The BNT system would take me to 42nd Street, where it ended, Times Square. Then I would have to transfer to the IRT, the Independent Rapid Transit System, for another nickel. And that would take me to 140th Street in Manhattan, where City College was. One of the subway stops was 116th Street. Columbia University, as the subway surfaced at 116th Street, was Columbia University. Oh boy, how I would love to have been at Columbia University. Can you imagine Columbia University, one of the top universities of the country? I passed it at 116th Street, but I was lucky to get to 145th Street. City College, tuition free. 10 cents going, 10 cents coming back. 5 cents bologna sandwiches in the cafeteria. 5 cents a bologna sandwich. Yeah. It was tough. It was tough.
Now, how did you get that money? Because there wasn't that kind of money.
My mother worked as a seamstress.
Okay.
We survived the Depression because my mother worked continuously as a seamstress. International Ladies Garment Workers Union.
Yeah. Igloo.
Do you remember Mr. Dubinsky and Mr., the Italian name, who were president of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union? May I tell you how the International Ladies Garment Workers Union was established?
It's your story.
There was a shop in Lower Manhattan that did some work, and they hired a lot of new immigrants, mostly Jewish and Italian women, in a tenement on the Lower East Side. At one point, the lower floor of that building went on fire. People still don't know how the building got on fire. So as the fire spread to the upper floors where the women were working, they had no means of escape because the fire escape had been sealed by the owner of the building, because they did not want the ladies to go off to smoke. So they didn't want any extra to leave early. So they actually locked the fire escape stairwell. Now this is in the historical fact. It's in the history books. They actually locked the stairwell to prevent these women, mostly women. There were a few men, mostly women, actually locked. A lot of the women who escaped the fire jumped off, killed themselves. A lot of the women were incinerated as the fire spread to the floor. 102 of them lay on the sidewalk. There is a picture of it. You can get it in your fancy machines if you want to.
You mean
Lying
computer?
on the sidewalk, unidentified, charred and burned. It took weeks to identify these women and a few men who were charred and burned in the fire. That the workers, the owners of the company were put on trial and exonerated, which I think is a travesty.
How come?
It's a travesty. They had political pull, I guess. I won't quote the nationality.
We're not going into politics.
I won't go into nationality or politics.
All right, fair.
Okay? Because there is a strict nationality involved. But they must have had some political pull because they never were fined or punished for anything. And yet there were 102 women lying on the sidewalk that you can find pictures of if you want to. But it did prong or stimulate the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, one established by an Italian, I'll think of his name in a minute, and one is David Dubinsky. Of course, most of these workers were Italian and Jewish women. I'll think of the Italian name in a minute. Anyway, so they established the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. My mother, who arrived in the States the exact same year, fortunately wasn't caught up in that fire because she had just landed in America about a week after that fire occurred, because I bet she would have applied to that company for a job.
Mm-hmm. Could be.
So she became a seamstress, applied for membership, the dues, which they paid happily. She told me happily, whatever the dues were. She paid happily because the Davinsky and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union began to give them some benefits, began to cut down the workers' hours, began to give them some union pensions, medical insurance.
Mm-hmm. All the good
God
stuff.
bless the ILGWU, International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Antonini. There was an Antonini,
yes.
was the Italian,
Old
and
Goomba.
David Dubinsky was the Jewish, because most of these women who died were Italian and Jewish
you
women.
said that. Yeah.
And they started the International Ladies Garment Workers Union.
Okay, you're not a union organizer. We'll drop
And
that.
my mother happily paid her dues, and she worked as a seamstress most of her life. And we were able to survive because she worked as a seamstress, which paid her well. And my father piddled around. He sold Good Humor ice cream for a while. He worked as a photographer on the boardwalk at Coney Island,
Okay.
doing these tintypes of people. You want to buy your picture on your while you're walking Coney Island boardwalk. And I spent a lot of my youth on Coney Island, walking or taking the 5-cent subway.
Oh, good.
And I can give you some stories
Well,
about Coney
we
Island
only
if
have
you
an
want
hour. So, okay, but now, when did you get through high school, and then what after that?
1935.
Okay, then where did you go?
Then I applied to the College of the City of New York, called CCNY. And if you had a grade over, I forget what it was, let's say 85, you were allowed to apply.
So it was highly selective.
You were selected, academically selected, absolutely, not politically, academically selected. I think the grade was 85.
Oh,
If you had a grade over 85, which I did, you could apply. Unfortunately, I was 15 years old, and the first required course when I had to take it, I wanted to be a doctor. I had to get into the Bachelor of Science routine, not the Bachelor of Arts, the Bachelor of Science. The required course was calculus, high calculus. I flunked.
For medical? Excuse me, go ahead, your story.
Calculus, I couldn't manage it. I was dropped from the course. Before midterm. So I figured, the hell with it. If I'm going to be a doctor, I better sharpen up. So that's a good whack in the whatever you want at age 15 to say if you're going to be anywhere, you better sharpen up. So I managed thereafter to pass all the courses at City College. And I majored in biology. Fortunately, the best grades I got were in biology. and I wanted to be a doctor, though I suffered in organic chemistry and I suffered in physics, but I passed them. I didn't want to be an engineer. I wanted to be a doctor. So, the only grades I ever got was in drafting, and I'm good with artistic work. There was a required course in drafting. I got an A, and the only A's I ever got were in biology. All the other courses were just passable.
But you passed them.
But I passed them. The only other course I got a D- was from an Italian professor who was a Florentine, and he couldn't flunk me, but since I was a Sicilian background, he gave me a D-. And to this day, so help me, I believe I was worth more than a D-.
All right.
He could have given me a C, which I would have accepted, because I got good grades in foreign languages, French and Italian. I didn't bother with Latin. I said, Latin is a dead language. And that's one time they said, you got to take Latin to be a doctor. I said,
Why?
it's a dead language. So I didn't take Latin. It didn't stop me from getting into medical school, fortunately. But I took French and Italian. And this Italian guy who was a Florentine probably knew I was a Sicilian background, and he gave me a D-. Come on, maybe I'm putting it on too much, but
I think so.
when
but
you're a
anyway.
kid, and you're known as a Sicilian, and this guy's a Florentine, and he has this gold chain with a pendant of the Order of the Florentines, what do you think as a kid? God, I think I'm better than a D-.
Okay.
Anyway, I got through City College medical school, City College. I applied to medical school, and I didn't apply to the fancy schools in Manhattan. I applied to the two-bit recognized medical school in Brooklyn, the Long Island College of Medicine. If you remember at that time, some of the top schools in the country were Johns Hopkins, University of California, University of Chicago, Columbia, Cornell, NYU. And Flower was the homeopathic fourth medical school in Manhattan. And this orphan in Brooklyn was the Long Island College of Medicine, barely hanging on for approval. So I managed to get into the Long Island, it was then called the Long Island College of Medicine, and we worked at the Long Island College Hospital. Later, New York State bought the medical school, and it became the downstate medical center school of the state of New York. After I graduated years later, New York State moved in and bought it out.
Okay.
And it became recognized as the one in Syracuse, as a recognized state medical school of the state of New York.
It met all the requirements, so it was certified.
Certified. Anyway, I was lucky as a clam. I sold blood to make money. Do you realize that? May I say
$25,
that?
I'll bet.
May I say that? At that time, the Red Cross didn't have a monopoly on giving blood. But when doctors needed blood, they'd apply for volunteers. That $25 per pint of blood was worth
Room and board.
20, let's see, 50 cents. What was 50 cents? Something was 50 cents. Oh, when I worked at City College in the book room, I got 50 cents an hour, which was decent in those days. But when you sold a pint of blood, you got $25. That's a 50-hour work week, right? $25
yeah.
against 50 cents an hour. So whenever they took my blood and I passed the test, you know, the American Red Cross hadn't established itself yet for volunteer blood. You're not supposed to sell blood anymore. But in those days, you could for $25. And I sold blood whenever I was allowed, and my hemoglobin was adequate. And that $25 came in handy. God, you could live. For $25, you could live. I remember a couple, if the time comes to me, I'll be able, this was all, fortunately, this was all in Brooklyn. Of course, the hospitals in Brooklyn asked for blood, volunteers. And maybe the names of these hospitals will come to me. Where I sat there, and this was a direct transfusion, by the way. directly to the patient.
Okay, no middleman.
No intermediary, no storing in a bottle to put on a shelf and serve it. This was me to the patient with a pump in the side, pumping it. And they tried to make it only a pint. It may have been less than a pint, it may have been more. There was no counting system, but this is what I did. And those $25 came in handy,
Amen.
I assure you. During the Depression years, they were lean years. And my mother worked her ass off, excuse the expression, on the subway, taking the subway an hour to Manhattan when we lived in Brooklyn, and an hour back home cooking the meals. So at that point, I appreciated what my mother did. My mother and I were close. Oh, that reminds you. That reminds me. May I say something else?
If it's not more than an hour.
Am I over talking?
No, but I'll hold you back.
Hold me back. At one point, when they realized I was going to be a doctor, and at that time you needed 4 years of college, you know, there was this fellow who made the inspection from Massachusetts, his name doesn't come to me, where he established that a medical school to be grade A had a certain requirements. So he knocked off several of the medical schools which were secondary, like the one in Waltham, I forget the name, in Massachusetts that he knocked off because he accredited. He was a Jewish inspector from Chicago who accredited medical schools. So when I decided to be a doctor, my mother and father realized, who's this kid let loose? Is he serious? So I remember my father, who was not working at the time, would occasionally trail me to make sure I wasn't getting into trouble. Because at that time in Brooklyn, there's a hell of a lot of trouble, and most kids get into trouble. But and the final test was when she took me to a movie called Il Zappatore. Do you speak Italian or Mexican? No. Il Zappatore is a word for the Zapati. The pig diggers, whatever, the people who work by pick and shovel.
Oh, the diggers. Okay.
One of the Mexican revolutionaries of that era was a Zapata. Zapata means he was a Zapata. That wasn't his real name. That was his assumed name because he was a Zapata. He was a revolutionary for the people, the poor peasants of Mexico. So he became a Zapata. So the word Zapatisti would be the workers who worked it. So they made a movie called Zapata and used this Mexican revolutionary. And the point of the story was this only son of a family, farm-working family who worked their asses off. Excuse the expression.
You're going to get us in trouble.
With pick and shovel. And he was the only son, and he was allowed to go to school. And at that time, to go to school, you'd have to get on a donkey, and God knows how far away the school was. And they'd have to put you up because there was nothing in town. You'd have to be put up at the university. Which still existed. I remember another classmate of mine existed 50 years later, that the father would have to put the kid on a donkey to take him to medical school. Well, I went, where am I? Zapata. So anyway, I passed the test. I wasn't fooling around in school. Out to the Zapata, but the point of the Zapata's movie was when the parents finally went to visit the son who never wrote them letters, he was in the bar room. Wine, women, and song was his curriculum. So my father or mother didn't give me a speech, but you got the lesson. You son of a bitch.
Hey, watch your language.
I'm sorry.
Can we? Okay.
But that's the equivalent in Italian, and I wish I could remember the Italian.
I don't need to know that. Okay.
The Italian is probably worse, but I don't remember the Italian. It was probably an Italian, but you son of a gun. If you're going to waste our time and money and effort and fool around, I kept my mouth shut, and that was it. They didn't give me the speech. They showed me the movie.
All right.
It did the trick.
You got the message, though.
I got the message.
Okay.
I paid attention to what I was doing. I never flunked out of school. I try to help by selling my blood, working for 50 cents an hour in the emergency room, working summer jobs. You realize your parents are behind you. My father had lost his job in the Depression. Ed Pinot Perfumery was a luxury item.
I know.
Forget about it. Remember Ed Pinot? So I did my job. I worked
diligently.
I worked monetarily, crucially. I worked fortunately, the subways got me to medical school. I didn't have a car. I worked the BMT subway to medical school. I had to take all other subway lines when they would take us to other hospitals, affiliated hospitals for clinical experience, like the Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn, or the Brooklyn Hospital in Brooklyn, or the Maimonides Jewish Hospital in Brooklyn, or the Protestant hospitals to get some kind of clinical training.
Okay.
Fortunately, in medical school, everything was in Brooklyn.
All right. When you finally got through and graduated, did you have to go any further studies as far as doing any interning? When did you get into medical school and graduate? Yeah. I'm trying to get to the time when you actually got qualified and were going into the service. No. That's what this is all about.
Okay, by this time the war had started, so to accelerate doctors, which they began to need, we lost the 42 summer vacation and went through school. The last senior year, we started in July of 42, so that we lost the 3 months of summer vacation of 42. All schools did that, all medical schools did that, and we graduated in March instead of June of 1943. We were allowed, the government allowed us 9 months of internship. All medical students who graduated in March of 1943 were allowed 9 months of internship before you were drafted, or if you had signed, as I did, to the Medical Administrative Corps to be put in the Army.
Okay.
And in January of 1943, we were commissioned.
Where and how did you get into the service? Where did you take your oath and so forth? So we can get onto that line.
We took our oath in Barkley, Texas, Camp Barkley, Texas, in the desert of Western Texas. January of 1943, we swore allegiance to the states. They made us first lieutenants. We had been second lieutenants, Medical Administrative Corps. Now we were first lieutenants, Medical Corps. And to train us physically, 1,000 of us were taken to Camp Barkley in Texas, in the wilds of Texas, for some physical training and some azimuths, some fancy intelligence and Army language. I remember the word azimuth. Do you remember the word azimuth?
No.
Something about directions.
Yours, not mine. Anyway.
They try to give us some medical as well as military training.
Give us a military bearing.
Military bearing to learn.
Close order drill, that sort of stuff?
Right, that sort of stuff, marching.
How did you do on
that?
But
some of us were 30, 40. In fact, some of us were close to 50. Some doctors who had volunteered were down there. Well, after a few days of drilling, they gave up. They gave up. We all figured they weren't going to make they weren't going to make any of the 40 or 50-year-old Altacockers physical specimens. So we all, those 6 weeks at Camp Barkley finally became almost laughable because we were just a big bunch of buddies. And then they began to, as the Army realized they had 1,000 of us. Before that, you know, they were in Pennsylvania. Do you remember that organization in Pennsylvania where they trained doctors?
No.
Well, since they had 1,000 of us, they had to open up this new facility in Texas, which they couldn't handle in Pennsylvania before then. So they had 1,000 of us, so somebody had to figure out where to put us. So they began to put us in various hospitals in service.
Civilian hospitals or government?
Army hospitals,
all right.
As first lieutenants. So at one point, they decided to make me an anesthesiologist.
You didn't opt for that, or they just said to you, this is what you're going to be?
I don't remember if we were offered, but even if we were offered, they were going
They
to do
wanted
it
you for that. All
what
right.
they wanted.
Okay. All right.
They wanted anesthesiologists because before that only the nurses were giving anesthesiologists. There were very few professional MD anesthesiologists. In those days, it was looked upon by doctors as something the nurses should do.
Oh, that's dangerous.
My mother-in-law was a nurse, anesthesia. We called them anesthetists. If you were an MD, you became an anesthesiologist.
Oh yeah, $10 more.
$10 more an hour. So the Army needed and wanted anesthesiologists. So they had a Dr. Leroy, one of the few professional anesthesiologists in service, train me personally in anesthesia, how to do a spinal anesthesia, how to do cyclopropane, how to do intravenous injections, how to intubate, pass a tube into the trachea of the patient so he doesn't choke and suffocate. So he gave me a quick course in anesthesiology. And the Army made me an anesthesiologist.
And then what they do with you?
They assigned me to the 154th General Hospital in, I think they were in Tennessee. Excuse me, it doesn't matter.
All right.
In Tennessee. And I became an anesthesiologist at that hospital. But that hospital was being organized. Am I talking too much? No.
Yep.
Being organized for overseas duty. And before you know it, the 154th Hospital was put on the Queen Elizabeth I, I guess. This was before they made the two. There were 15,000 of us crammed onto the Queen Elizabeth.
All doctors?
Not all doctors.
Just
no.
troops. Okay.
American troops.
Heading for Le Havre?
Right. No, not at that time.
All
Not
right.
at that time.
Go ahead. I want to get you over there.
No, they still hadn't invaded France. We ended up in Scotland, Greenock, Scotland. 15,000 of us. We were in triple-tier bunks, 2 meals a day, unescorted. The Queen Elizabeth could outrun any submarine, so we went out unescorted. English-style meals. The complement of the boat was English. We paid the English. They're our allies. We paid them. They didn't do it for free. They're buddies, they're allies. We paid them. I don't know how much, but we paid them for the use of the Queen Elizabeth. Anyway, there were 15,000 of us. We landed at Greenock, Scotland, on the western part of Scotland. And we were greeted with Red Cross girls, donuts and candy and goodies, and given a little bit of then quickly put on trains. And we ended up in mid-England, town called midway between Bristol and London. Oh, God.
It's unimportant. You were there.
Midway between, the town will come to me. We put up in tents, and we started a hospital, tent hospital, expecting the casualties of the impending landings in France.
Yeah.
They were planning, the hierarchies were planning the intent. I don't remember the other parts of the war in Sicily or in Africa, but we were now in Western Europe. But they were planning the landings in France, and they were establishing an airfield where we were establishing our tents. And they were proposing to bring their casualties of the landings at, what were the two landings in France?
Normandy.
Normandy, right. That's close enough. I forget the names of the landings in Normandy.
Utah and Omaha, if you want the names.
I forget the two names of the two beaches.
Yeah,
Utah Beach and
Utah
another one. It doesn't matter.
All right.
It doesn't matter. It was Normandy. So we were prepared to accept them as they began to fly in. And sure enough, June 6th, the invasion started, and the casualties began to, those who could survive and were treated by the first aid men, those who could survive and needed treatment were flown to England. And they were flown to, I'm sure, other bases, but they were flown to the airfield, which was next to the hospital we had established. And by that time, before I got, do you want to hear how I got to the continent from England?
If you want to tell us,
Yeah, I might as well tell
Make it
you.
a quick trip because the clock keeps running.
Right, a quick trip. I was an anesthesiologist at the 154th Hospital, and so they needed male anesthesiologists because they had established teams. They had established surgical teams,
Well, like a MASH unit?
which could be mobile.
Yeah, okay.
And the first instance was in this war. They established, rather than move whole hospitals, they established teams where people of 6, 3 doctors, a nurse, and 2 corpsmen could be moved around where the action and the need was.
Okay.
So they, as an anesthesiologist, they gave me orders to meet the group which after the invasion and war had established in Maastricht, Holland. And I remember vividly those days where I had to find my own way. I was given priority orders to fly from Britain to Paris because somebody said I was needed. So they gave me priority orders. But once I hit Paris, I had to find my own way. There was no subway. There was no railroad. Okay, fella, Dr. Muset, you're a first lieutenant. Now find your way to Maastricht, Holland. And there's no direct subway line to Maastricht, Holland. So I had to find my own way.
That's all you took.
So you took my own way. And one night layover was in a town called Liège, Belgium. You remember Liège, Belgium?
No.
Liège, Belgium was the route of the German V-1 bombs.
Oh,
You remember the V-1
buzz
bombs?
bombs.
The motorcycle
Yeah.
noise? So I managed to get to Liège, Belgium. You take whatever ride you get the event. One of the stopovers was Liège, Belgium, which is the route of the V-1 bombs. Those sputtering motorcycle noise bombs. You'd hear them coming. And as you say, once the noise stopped, watch out,
yeah, that's when you had trouble.
watch out. Anyway, so the one night in Liège, the buzz bombs began to come over. So I slept under the bed. The hell with that, So I slept under the bed and got away with it. And I managed to get to Maastricht, Holland, again, thumbing your way. And they made me the anesthesiologist with 2 general surgeons, a Genevieve Flood, a nurse from Massachusetts, and 2 corpsmen. Unfortunately, I've forgotten the name of the corpsman. One was a kid named Frenchie. They were kids about 17, 18-year-old. Very helpful. They did all the work of putting the operating rooms together, cleaning the apparatus. And Genevieve Flood supervised the 2 corpsmen to set up the operating suites for the 2 doctors I worked with. I worked with these 2 gentlemen doctors. I might as well give them credit. They were lovely gentlemen. Oh, God. One was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the other one from Erie, Pennsylvania. Oh, isn't that awful? 2 lovely gentlemen, surgeons, and I was their anesthesiologist to put their patients to sleep. More often than not, those patients who finally got to us and were put on the stretchers, more often than not, those wouldn't survive. They were so far gone, even with the blood or treatment that the first 8 people gave them. A lot of them wouldn't survive getting off these operating tables, but we did the best we could. These are massive chest and abdominal injuries. That's a pretty tough injury. There was a separate neurosurgeon. He did the heads. Fortunately, we didn't have to do the heads. They had a separate ENT team who did the eyes, ears, nose, and throat. And there's a separate ophthalmologist who did the eyes. And there were separate orthopedists who did the extremities. But we were the general surgical team who did the chest and the abdominal injuries. And some of them were pretty good. So we managed to help quite a few of them. And then they were prepared to be sent back overseas to the States.
They
to
go
the
back by
States.
ship or plane?
By ship. By this time they had established, in other words, whenever the Queen Elizabeth went back after she unloaded,
Okay, she was
she became a
seagoing
troop
ambulance,
ship.
yeah.
They used anything they can.
yeah.
It was too expensive to fly them back. It would have been better if they could fly them back, but how could you fly several hundred, several thousands? By the way, do you know statistics of World War II?
No.
Would it be inappropriate to mention that?
If it's not going to take too long, we got 8 minutes left and we haven't said much.
Well, I think, yeah, okay.
If it's important to you,
I think
yes.
it's important to me
Okay, give it to us.
that we could kill 60 million people between 1939, or allow the deaths of 60 million people between 1939 and 1945. Not all military. Remember, not all military.
I know, you're including all
Remember,
of,
26 million Russians died.
yeah.
Wait, 27 million. 16 million soldiers, 11 million civilians. There were a lot of people I asked, how many Russians died? 27 million. How many American people died, soldiers? 300,000. Who took the major brunt of that war? You take your pick and pick it yourself. Anyway, these are statistics you learn later. But I think I did my job. I think we did our job helping these kids. 16. Some kids lied about their age.
I know that. Oh, yeah.
Some kids lied. 16 year we found out later. Lied. You know, they looked like they could be 17 or 18. And these poor kids lose your leg, lose your arm. Well, we did the best we could. It was our job. We found out a little bit later a lot of the backroom politics of war. But I won't go into that now. But so anyway, we were in Germany until the war ended, and then we were made. We took control of the German hospitals as doctors. They told us to take care of the German civilian hospitals. I don't know what they did with the German soldiers or the German military hospitals, but I was in a town called Neheim in the industrial belt of Germany at that time, and we took care of the 2 civilian hospitals in the town of Neheim. And
What do you mean by took care of? You actually
make sure that the
you ran it, made sure the civilians were taken care of too?
civilians were taken care of.
Yeah.
And the first thing we did was to take the uniforms of the Germans, to force them to wear civilian clothes, and we take the German uniforms. And Dr. Blatt and I, Dr. Blatt was a Jewish boy, a Jewish doctor who helped me. Dr. Blatt and I, at his persuasion, we piled all these German uniforms and burnt them, incinerated them. So all these German civilians working in the hospitals now came up in civilian clothes. That was the only thing we did to try to neutralize the warlikeness of the Germans, I guess is the only way you can put it. To force these civilian doctors into civilian clothes, not to stay out of military uniforms. Now, they suffered because clothes and food for the Germans became quite a struggle for them. Quite a struggle for them. Then finally, when the war in Japan was still on, and they think they had the occupying troops in Germany, they reassembled us in Maastricht, Holland, and then trucked us, and army trucks trucked us to a camp north of Marseille, France, in the desert. North of Marseille, about 30 miles north, is a desert, and they had set up tents for us in Marseille, France, and they unloaded us. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, the war lasted. By the time they could clear the port of Marseille, which was sabotaged ships they had to clear.
That was a mess.
So by the time they could organize enough people to go to Japan, now the war in Japan was on, we lingered outside the port of Marseille for a couple of months. Fortunately, they allowed us a little time off so that we wouldn't start killing each other or gambling. So by the time we were ready to go to Japan, the war ended. So we were among the first to come back home.
Okay.
So in Marseille, they were smart enough to take us to the fancy hotel on the Riviera in Marseille, in what's that fancy town in Marseille, on the Riviera of
Monaco?
Cannes.
All right.
You know, Con, that fancy resort.
I don't know anything about Europe. I was in the
that
other
fancy
pond.
five-star hotel. They
Okay.
gave us a weekend there. Anyway, so I'm talking. Anyway, the war ended when the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan. We were in Marseille. We got on one of the first boats, and they brought us back to Virginia.
In 4,000 words or less, when you got home, you opened up your own practice?
No, I spent another year in service.
Okay, but then after you're through the service, what did you all, to get back here to New Manchester? We've only got a couple of minutes, but I want to get you home anyway.
Okay, well, since I admired the two doctors I work with and I was unmarried, I decided to undergo training of 4 extra years to train myself as a surgeon. By that time, the requirements were stiffened up, so you didn't no longer be a self-proclaimed surgeon. You had to go through 4 years of training, which I did after service. Fortunately, I was unmarried and could do that.
The GI Bill cover that for you? Did the
GI Bill covered me. Yes,
Okay.
the GI Bill covered. So I spent 4 extra years training myself as a surgeon. And then when I got married, I had to get off my tuchus, as the Brooklyn people say, and find a life for my wife and my kids. I got married in 1949. I got 19, well, I finished my training. Of course, I wasn't going to let anything stand in my way of what I wanted to train myself as a surgeon. Of course, I admired the 2 surgeons I worked with.
Okay.
And at that time, anesthesia was almost for the girls.
Okay, honey. Wrapping this up, with what you said and done, do you feel that your service was a positive or negative impact on your life?
Positive.
In 2, 3 words or less.
I did something good. I helped kids who needed medical help. And I thought I didn't kill anybody. I wasn't asked to kill anybody.
That's good.
And I think I helped some of these young kids survive, even without an arm, even without a leg. Massive pulmonary abdominal who could survive.
Okay, we're getting gory. 2 words. Thank you, friend.
You're welcome.
And thank you for your service.
You're welcome.
You still got a good hand.
Thank you.
That's a wrap, folks. Those of you who've seen the show, I hope you'll think about it. And if you are a veteran, give us a call. We're here to try and make sure that your story will not be overlooked. Bob Stevens again saying thank you. Stay healthy. Come and see us.